Tonight, imagine the hush of a Victorian sick room. The air is heavy with candle wax and damp cloth, the kind of scent that makes you wonder if someone left a boiled potato under the bed weeks ago and simply decided it was part of the decor. A fire smoulders reluctantly in the grate, coughing out little puffs of smoke like it's just as tired as you are. On the bedside table, bottles glimmer with amber liquid, powders are carefully piled in paper packets, and a set of leeches wiggle in a jar as though excited for their dinner reservation. The curtains are drawn, not only to block the chill, but also to keep the nosy neighbours from peeking in and spreading tomorrow's gossip. Your head sinks against the pillow, but rest doesn't come easily. Every cough rattles your chest, every creak in the floorboards makes you tense, and then there's the sound of your physician bustling in with his leather bag. He wears a top hat he probably refuses to remove because it makes him feel like the very image of authority. His beard is magnificent, though perhaps better at catching soup than conveying medical competence. He sets down his instruments with a clatter, forceps, scalpels, bottles, and the infamous leech jar, which glistens with all the promise of a spa treatment designed by Dracula's accountant. You'd probably never make it through a single Victorian night, but don't worry, I'll guide you safely through. So before we go any further, if this quiet company helps, you can gently tap like and subscribe, but only if it feels right to your heart. And hey, I'd love to know where you're listening from, maybe lying awake in New York or drifting in a quiet room in London. Drop your time and place below, so none of us feel alone tonight. Now, dim the lights, let your shoulders relax, and let's begin tonight's slow, strange journey. Together, here on Timeless Sleep. The doctor leans over you with a confidence that borders on alarming. He carries himself as though centuries of trial and error have already been solved, though in truth you're basically a guinea pig in starched sheets. He pulls a thermometer from his bag, but not the neat glass kind you'd recognise. Instead, it's a bulbous contraption that looks like something stolen from a child's chemistry set. He frowns at your pulse, mutters about imbalanced humours, and considers whether your condition calls for bloodletting, blistering, or, if he's feeling particularly avant-garde, both. His optimism is unsettling. He truly believes he's saving you, even as he prepares the bowl for your blood. Victorians adored the idea that illness came from an excess of something inside you. Too much blood, too much bile, too much invisible nonsense floating in your body like bad house guests overstaying their welcome. The solution? Open the door and let some out. This is where the leeches perk up, pressing against the glass like overeager puppies at a pet shop. The candlelight flickers on his instruments, gleaming metal that promises relief in theory but screams disaster in practice. You shift uncomfortably, and he pats your arm with the assurance of a man who once read half a pamphlet and decided it counted as lifelong expertise. The truth is, this sick room isn't just your story. It's a scene replayed in countless Victorian households. Imagine city streets where doctors rush from one home to the next, leather bags swinging, boots clattering over cobblestones slick with rain and horse manure. The fog wraps the city in a blanket of eerie silence, while inside families whisper anxiously, waiting to see what marvel or misery medicine will bring tonight. Now, to be fair, not everything was pure disaster. Victorians did try. They experimented with anaesthetics. Chloroform and ether made dramatic entrances, though early doses were less gentle nap and more accidental trip to the afterlife. They emphasised cleanliness sometimes, though their definition of clean often meant dabbing the scalpel on a trouser leg before diving back into surgery. And when germs finally got their PR makeover in the late century, a few brilliant minds began shouting that invisible creatures might be the culprits. The rest of the medical community naturally treated this as wild gossip. After all, who wants to admit that their hands are murder weapons every time they skip the soap? Still, in your sick room tonight, the doctor isn't thinking about germs, he's thinking about balance. He ties a cloth around your arm, selects a leech, and positions it carefully. The creature latches on with the enthusiasm of someone who hasn't seen a buffet in weeks. You wince, but he nods approvingly, like a proud gardener admiring his roses. This was medicine in the 1800s, a strange mixture of ritual, superstition, and unshakable confidence. Doctors prescribed powders of antimony to induce vomiting, calomel, which was basically mercury in disguise, to purge your bowels, and opium for just about everything else. Your body wasn't a patient, it was a battlefield. The goal wasn't comfort, it was control. And if the cure nearly killed you, well, better luck next appointment. One can almost admire the creativity. For example, if you had tuberculosis, doctors might recommend fresh seaside air, which was sensible, or inhaling the smoke of burning creosote, which was less so. Women fainting from nervous exhaustion were often diagnosed with hysteria, which could be treated with rest cures. Translation, you weren't allowed to move for weeks, or with a doctor-provided massage that, frankly, is best left as an awkward historical footnote. Meanwhile, pharmacists became the neighbourhood's unofficial magicians. Their shelves glowed with tinctures, tonics and remedies labelled with such confidence you'd think they'd been tested in the world's most rigorous laboratory rather than dreamed up after a particularly vivid breakfast. Laudanum bottles promised to soothe headaches, calm coughs and settle stomachs. Basically Victorian ibuprofen, if ibuprofen also caused addiction and hallucinations. Mothers spooned it into infants' mouths with the same casualness you'd use for honey, never realising they were slowly cultivating future ghosts in bonnets. Back in your sick room, the leech falls off with a satisfied plop, your blood trickling into the waiting cloth. The doctor hums approvingly, already scribbling notes in handwriting so illegible it could double as an abstract painting. He believes you'll feel lighter soon, because of course you will. You've just lost half a pint of blood and fainting is very slimming. The family gathers anxiously at the door. They trust this man, because he wears authority like an extra waistcoat. They trust his powders, his leeches, his muttered Latin incantations. To doubt him would mean admitting there's nothing anyone can do, and that's far too terrifying. So they nod, thank him profusely, and hand over a payment that could have bought 3 decent dinners and a new set of curtains. You close your eyes, drowsy not from health but from exhaustion. The fire cracks softly, the candle gutters, and the doctor's footsteps fade down the hall. Tomorrow he'll do it all again for another patient, carrying the same confidence, the same bag, and the same dangerous optimism. And you, tucked beneath heavy blankets that smell faintly of mildew, drift in and out of uneasy dreams, half believing that the cure might work, half fearing that the cure is what will finish you. The next morning you wake in that same hushed room, only now your ribs feel compressed like a library book, squeezed shut by an overzealous binder. It isn't just illness pressing on you, it's your corset, laced up tight in the name of fashion and, more alarmingly, medicine. Imagine this, a physician standing proudly beside your fainting frame, declaring with a straight face that the whalebone cage around your body is doing wonders for your delicate nerves. Translation: you're prettier when half your organs have relocated north for the season. The corset was never only clothing in the Victorian world. For doctors, it was therapy. Slouching, they warned, led to weak lungs, poor morals, and possibly an unladylike sense of independence. The solution? Lace your body into architectural rigidity until breathing felt like an optional hobby. If you collapsed mid-tea, well, congratulations. Your corset was working as intended. Nothing said health like a gentle swoon in the drawing room, preferably landing near a sofa. Fainting was so frequent it practically became an Olympic sport. 1 medal for gracefully tumbling beside the pianoforte, 2 if you did it while balancing a plate of cucumber sandwiches. Doctors even argued corsets corrected spinal problems, and technically, they weren't wrong. If you strap a plank of whalebone to someone's back, it does keep them upright. The problem was everything else. Ribs bent inward like reluctant accordion keys, lungs compressed into tiny balloons, and stomachs shoved toward the spine. Add in a hearty Victorian dinner of mutton, boiled potatoes and suspiciously grey pudding, and you had a recipe for acid reflux that could haunt an entire household. Still, the prescription persisted. Better to sacrifice breathing than beauty. Picture the daily ritual. A maid yanks at the laces while you cling to a bedpost, counting each tug like it's a confession of sins. Just 1 more pull, she says, though she said that 6 pulls ago. By the end, your waist is pinched into the circumference of a saucer. Fashion magazines call this the hourglass ideal, though from your perspective it feels closer to the coffin preview. Step out into society like this, and every breath is shallow, every word a gasp, every laugh a potential medical emergency. And yet the men nod approvingly, oblivious that their compliments are aimed at a woman currently debating whether she can make it through dinner conscious. Doctors linked corsets to cures for everything from scoliosis to indigestion. If you were listless, tighten the stays. If you had back pain, lace harder. If your womb was wandering, and yes, they did believe wombs could wander around like mischievous pets, then nothing steadied it better than squeezing the entire torso until the poor organ had nowhere left to roam. It's one of those brilliant moments in history when medical advice and fashion colluded to nearly suffocate half the population, all while insisting it was for their own good. Even children weren't spared. Young girls wore training corsets to mould them into proper shapes before their bodies had even finished growing. Imagine being 7 and already wearing a medical device that told your spine, straighten up, or else. Childhood games took on a new dimension. Hopscotch while breathless, jump rope while ribs whined in protest, doll playing while organs quietly wrote resignation letters, and fainting couches, those elegant curving pieces of furniture still haunting antique shops, weren't whimsical flourishes of interior design. They were functional necessities, stationed like emergency exits in parlours, galleries, and boudoirs. Every faint was blamed on nerves, conveniently overlooking the giant corseted boa constrictor coiled around your torso. Society treated these collapses as delicate, romantic interludes, as though women enjoyed blacking out mid-conversation. Reality check. No one finds it dreamy when you pass out into the custard at dessert. The corset, of course, carried its own paradox. It was both status symbol and medical straitjacket. The wealthy could afford intricate, custom-made stays with embroidered silk and steel boning. The poor managed with simpler versions, but still endured the squeeze. For doctors, the corset was a one-size-fits-all prescription, useful whether you suffered from fainting, fatigue, or simply an inconvenient surplus of ribs. Meanwhile, humour magazines of the day poked fun at fainting society ladies, but never questioned the root cause. They illustrated scenes of women swooning into men's arms, while men looked heroic for catching them. Though let's be honest, those men were mostly thinking, how do I set her down without spilling my brandy? Even stranger, some medical men insisted corsets prevented tuberculosis by keeping the lungs properly inflated. This despite the reality that corsets worked more like overzealous bouncers, refusing entry to any breath larger than a sigh. But once a medical theory took hold in Victorian minds, it could cling tighter than the corset itself. Imagine walking through London streets in summer, the air already thick with coal smoke, horse dung, and the questionable perfume of fishmongers. Add a corset to the mix and you're essentially wearing a portable sauna. Sweat collects under the boning, fabric chafes against the skin, and every step feels like you're dragging an anvil disguised as fashion. And yet, to loosen the laces would invite whispers. Perhaps you were scandalous, perhaps too relaxed, perhaps dangerously modern. There were rare rebels who cast off corsets, especially toward the later decades. They championed rational dress, looser clothing that allowed women to breathe, walk, and even gasp exercise. Doctors sneered, society rolled its eyes, and fashion critics practically fainted on principle. But seeds of change had been planted. The rational dress movement suggested maybe health shouldn't be synonymous with organ rearrangement. Imagine that. Still, for most of the century, corsets held their grip. They were props in both fashion and medicine, symbols of refinement, proof of discipline. And each time a physician praised them as therapeutic, the cycle tightened. Women wore them longer, fainted more often, and believed their exhaustion was just another symptom of weak nerves rather than structural strangulation. It's the irony of Victorian medicine. The very garment designed to present health often created illness. You could spot the signs in pale cheeks, dark circles, shallow breathing, and ribs bent in ways that made X-ray machines of the future wince retroactively. Corsets were less about shaping waists than shaping lives, dictating how women moved, worked, and even thought of themselves. Back in your sick room, you feel the corset pinch as you try to sit up. The doctor peers down with that familiar air of certainty. "Excellent," he says. "Your breathing is constrained. just as it should be. He believes this sincerely, scribbling it into his notes with a flourish, and you, caught between fashion and medicine, lie back against the pillows, wondering how long until the fainting couch calls your name again. Outside, carriages clatter by, their wheels rattling over cobblestones. Somewhere, a shop window displays the latest corset designs. Narrower waists, tighter laces, advertisements promising elegance and health in one suffocating package. Young women will buy them eagerly, mothers will insist upon them, and doctors will nod approvingly from behind their spectacles. And you, trapped in this moment of Victorian logic, realise that your cure is also your cage. The corset, hailed as salvation, squeezes you toward fragility, one shallow breath at a time. Word count 1514. You said, continue, write this section. Exactly 1,500 to 1,550 words. ChatGPT said, Section 3. The doctor returns to your room, his boots clicking against the wooden floor like a metronome of misplaced confidence. He pulls another bottle from his leather bag, and when the candlelight hits it, you see the shimmering silver liquid inside. It glows faintly, like moonlight trapped in glass. You might think, ah, beautiful. You might even think, ah, safe. But that glow is mercury, the Victorian physician's favourite chemical sidekick, and possibly the most elegant way to ruin your body slowly. Mercury had long enjoyed a glamorous resume. For centuries it was the darling of alchemists and healers, praised as a purifier, a cleanser, a cure. By the 19th century, doctors prescribed it with the same enthusiasm modern pharmacies reserve for painkillers. If you had syphilis, mercury was your knight in shining armour. If you had constipation, mercury was considered a broom for your insides. If you had a vague, nameless malaise, that fashionable, nervous exhaustion, mercury might be offered with a pat on the hand and a promise that you'd feel fresher in no time. The results? Well, technically you did feel fresher, because mercury doesn't just pass through the body, sets up residence, redecorates, and then slowly demolishes every system it touches. Mouth ulcers bloomed like tiny unwelcome gardens. Teeth fell out with the drama of a horror novel. Gums turned spongy, hair shed in clumps, and tremors rattled your hands until they became a permanent part of your daily rhythm. Victorian diaries are littered with entries describing shaking palsy and loosened teeth, often written with such detached politeness you'd think they were talking about wallpaper peeling in the parlour instead of their bodies falling apart. And the mental toll, oh, that was the pièce de résistance. Mercury crept into the brain like an unwelcome tenant, bringing along mood swings, paranoia, and a touch of outright madness. Victorians coined phrases like the trembles and Mad Hatter syndrome, the latter born from hat makers who used mercury to stiffen felt and consequently spent their careers slowly unravelling like poorly sewn seams. Imagine you're shaping a jaunty top hat for a gentleman and, while you stitch, you mutter strange phrases to the empty air. Everyone assumes you're eccentric. In truth, you're being eaten alive by your own occupation. But doctors, they called this progress. Mercury was prescribed in pills, rubbed into ointments, and even vaporized for inhalation. Patients were told to smear it on their skin, to swallow it with a grimace, or to sit in rooms where the fumes thickened the air until lungs quivered. Each treatment was delivered with that familiar medical confidence, as though a glittering poison couldn't possibly be harmful if a man in a waistcoat handed it over. Take the case of syphilis. It was rampant in Victorian society, whispered about in polite circles and roaring in less polite ones. Mercury was the go-to cure. A night with Venus, a lifetime with Mercury, the saying went, neatly capturing both the problem and the so-called solution. Patients endured years of salivation, trembling and slow poisoning, all while doctors congratulated themselves for administering such a noble treatment. The disease didn't disappear, of course. It often hid, lingered or worsened. But as long as the patient sweated and drooled, the doctor could nod sagely and declare that the treatment was taking effect. Imagine lying in your own sick room as the doctor approaches with his silver cure. He pours a spoonful, the liquid clinging thickly to the metal, shimmering as it slides toward your lips. He assures you this will chase away the illness gnawing at your bones. You swallow, the metallic taste burning down your throat, and you wonder why salvation tastes suspiciously like coins melted in a cauldron. Hours later, your stomach churns, your teeth ache, your hands tremble, and yet the doctor beams. "Excellent," he says. "The body's responding." Translation: you are visibly suffering, therefore the cure must be working. In the wider city, mercury was everywhere. Apothecaries stocked calomel, a chalky powder laced with the poison, and prescribed it for children with teething pain. Yes, even infants. Tiny mouths coated with toxic dust. Tiny gums bleeding under the weight of medical authority. Mothers were told not to worry. The child would quiet soon. And quiet they did, though not in ways any parent would wish. The irony was sharp. Mercury was hailed as a cleanser, yet it left patients drooling into handkerchiefs. It was praised as invigorating, yet it left bodies trembling like quaking aspens. It was trusted as a mind stabilizer, yet it could catapult you into fits of paranoia so intense you'd accuse your wallpaper of plotting against you. And still, Victorian physicians defended it with the stubbornness of men who couldn't bear to admit they might be wrong. It wasn't just the poor or the desperate who fell victim. Wealthy households too had their cabinets stocked with mercury-based concoctions. Imagine a glittering dinner party, candles flickering across silver cutlery, women in satin gowns sipping wine. Behind the scenes, half the guests are nursing mercury prescriptions, their gums aching as they nibble delicately at roast beef, their hands shaking slightly as they lift their forks. But who would question the wisdom of doctors? To doubt them would be to admit fragility, and in the Victorian world fragility was supposed to be beautiful, especially if it came wrapped in a corset and accompanied by a trembling sigh. Even literature hinted at the madness of mercury. Characters with trembling hands or sudden rages often mirrored real-life victims. Yet instead of alarm, readers found entertainment. Madness was exotic, eccentric, amusing. A quirk of personality rather than a red flag of poisoning. Society romanticised the very symptoms of its slow death, dressing them up as charming flaws. Back in your own bed, you feel the silver working through you. Your tongue is heavy, your breath metallic, your vision fuzzy. The doctor notes your pallor, jots it down, and prescribes another dose for tomorrow. He believes in balance. Illness doesn't vanish instantly, so the cure must be applied persistently, even if it leaves you weaker each day. He leaves with his hat gleaming, his boots tapping, his bag lighter. And you, well, you lie beneath the heavy blankets, wondering how long your body can carry both the disease and the cure. The candle gutters again, the leeches shift restlessly in their jar, and you realise that in Victorian medicine, every remedy carries two prices, one in coins, the other in years of your life. The doctor does not return with leeches this time, nor does he bring the shimmering silver of mercury. Tonight he carries something altogether more comforting, more familiar. A little amber bottle, the glass warmed by the firelight so it looks like honey caught in a jar. The label curls at the edges, the ink faded but still legible. Laudanum. A word whispered in households like a lullaby, tucked into purses like a secret, poured into spoons like salvation. Laudanum was the Victorian cure-all, the bottle that promised peace to the restless, quiet to the anxious, and relief to anyone whose nerves had been classified as delicate, which was everyone, apparently. It was simply opium dissolved in alcohol, but doctors and apothecaries dressed it up with elegant names and soothing labels. It looked harmless, smelled faintly herbal, and slid down the throat with a burn disguised as warmth. In a century when pain relief usually meant biting a rag and praying, laudanum was a miracle, a dangerous miracle. You recline against your pillows, and the doctor offers the bottle with a paternal smile. He pours a spoonful, amber liquid gleaming like liquid dusk, and tips it gently toward your lips. For the cough, he says, for the nerves, for sleep. He doesn't mention that it's also for addiction, dependency, and the slow transformation into something more ghost than human. But then, that's hardly a selling point. Laudanum did not discriminate. It was everywhere. Writers sipped it when inspiration ran dry. Clergymen used it to soothe headaches after too many sermons. Mothers kept it in cupboards beside the tea, doling it out to restless infants, colicky toddlers, and themselves after long nights of fever and crying. A dose for the baby, a dose for the parent, and suddenly the household was wrapped in silence so profound it might as well have been a chapel. The beauty of laudanum from a Victorian perspective was its universality. Stomachache, laudanum, menstrual cramps, laudanum, tuberculosis, laudanum, depression, laudanum, toothache, heartbreak, nervous collapse, or the vague sense that life itself was simply too loud, all answered with the same amber liquid. Why bother with complicated diagnoses when one bottle promised to solve them all? Of course, the quiet it gave was deceptive. At first, laudanum worked wonders. Pain dulled, sleep arrived, anxieties melted like wax. You could breathe easier, smile easier, survive easier, but then, as days turned into weeks, the doses had to increase. A teaspoon became a tablespoon became a glass, and the body, so willing to surrender to the drug at first, soon demanded it with relentless hunger. Withdrawal clawed at nerves, sleeplessness returned with vengeance, and the only cure was more of the same poison. Picture a Victorian sitting room, lace curtains drawn against the fog. A woman reclines on the fainting couch, bottle of laudanum discreetly hidden in her lap. Her husband thinks she is pale because she's refined, fragile because she is feminine, distant because she's thoughtful. In truth, she is slipping, every sip drawing her further from the world around her. And when her friends compliment her ethereal beauty, they are admiring the work of opium, mistaking decay for grace. Writers romanticised it, of course. Thomas de Quincey made laudanum famous with his Confessions of an English Opium Eater, turning addiction into literature. His descriptions wove between ecstasy and torment, painting opium as both muse and monster. For every Victorian who read his warnings, 10 more read his words like an invitation, thinking, if it inspires such beauty, surely a drop won't hurt me. And so bottles multiplied, scattered across parlours, tucked into bedside tables, passed around dinner parties as casually as wine. The apothecary's shop became a theatre of bottles. Behind polished counters stood rows of glass containers, each labelled with ornate script, each glowing with promise. Laudanum occupied pride of place, offered with a knowing smile. Mothers bought it without question. Doctors prescribed it without hesitation. Advertisements in newspapers praised it as a balm for all of life's ills. It was, after all, cheaper than wine, easier than prayer, and more immediate than hope. Back in your sick room, you feel the laudanum warm your throat. It slides into your stomach, softening the edges of pain, wrapping your mind in a gauzy haze. The coughing quiets, the trembling fades, and for a moment you think, this is what healing feels like. The doctor smiles, tucks the bottle beside the bed, and assures you that another dose tomorrow will keep the peace. He doesn't mention that tomorrow's dose will need to be larger, or that peace will eventually demand loyalty like a tyrant. Victorian society tiptoed around the problem. They praised laudanum for saving lives, but whispered uneasily when friends slipped too far into dependency. Women were particularly vulnerable. Prescribed laudanum for everything from menstrual cramps to postpartum depression, many found themselves tethered to the bottle, without ever realizing when relief turned to reliance. And because faintness, fragility, and melancholy were all considered attractive traits in women, no one suspected that their beauty was simply addiction draped in silk. Children, too, were dosed without hesitation. Soothing syrups laced with opium were marketed directly to mothers. They promised to quiet restless infants, to ease teething pains, to grant parents a few hours of precious sleep. The reality was often silence of another kind, infants slipping too deeply into unconsciousness, sometimes never waking again. But those tragedies rarely made the advertisements. The bottles continued to sell. The irony is that laudanum truly did help. It dulled pain when no other options existed. It soothed when comfort seemed impossible. It offered sleep in a century where illness, noise, and grief stole rest like pickpockets in the night. And yet every sip carried a shadow. Every swallow invited dependency. Every bottle hid the potential for ruin. Imagine walking through London streets at dusk. In the window of every apothecary, bottles of laudanum gleam like fireflies. Behind doors and curtains, families take their doses, a spoon here, a sip there. Somewhere, a poet dips his quill after drinking deeply, words tumbling from his mind in a haze. Somewhere else, a mother rocks her infant, both of them drugged into silence, both of them appearing peaceful. The city hums with industry, but beneath it flows an undercurrent of opium, threading through veins as quietly as gas lamps flicker in the fog, and here you are, in your sick room, drifting under the influence of the amber cure. Your pain has softened, your breath has steadied, your mind is calm. But the calm is fragile, borrowed, purchased at the cost of tomorrow's hunger. You don't know it yet, but the bottle at your bedside is no visitor. It is a tenant. It will stay. It will demand. It will shape your nights until you, too, are a little ghost in lace. The candle burns lower, the shadows lengthen, and as you close your eyes you can almost hear the bottle whisper. Not in words, of course, but in silence. The silence it brings to the body, the silence it brings to the room, the silence that grows heavier with every dose. The morning fog lifts, and with it comes another parade of cures disguised as crimes. This time the doctor is particularly excited, which should worry you immediately. He carries not just one instrument, but a gleaming tray of them. Bowls, lancets, and bandages stacked neatly, as though he's preparing for a dinner party, where the main course is your circulation. He announces with grave authority that your humours are out of balance, and that the best way to restore equilibrium is to let out a little blood. To him, your body is less a patient and more a leaky barrel, and the solution to every problem is simply to open another spout. Bloodletting wasn't new in the Victorian age. It had been a medical darling for centuries, stretching back to the ancients. The Greeks swore by it, medieval barbers practiced it between haircuts, and Renaissance physicians defended it with academic ferocity. But the Victorians took this old, creaky theory and gave it new life, wielding their lancets with the same enthusiasm as a child with a new toy drum. Fever? Bleed it out. Headache? Bleed it out. General sense that your wife is complaining too much? Bleed her out. So, here you are, reclining in bed while the doctor ties a cloth around your arm with the confidence of a man who has definitely done this before, though, judging by the trembling hands, perhaps not as successfully as he remembers. He selects a lancet, sharp and cold, and with a flourish, he opens your vein. Blood flows into the bowl with alarming speed, dark and steaming in the morning light. The doctor smiles approvingly, as though he has just reset the universe with a flick of his wrist. You, of course, feel dizzy. Your head spins, the world tilts. But he insists this is normal. The illness is draining away, he murmurs. Translation: you're fainting because half your lifeblood is currently decorating his porcelain basin. Bloodletting was more than a medical treatment. It was practically a social ritual. Imagine entire households summoned to witness, family members hovering by the bed while the physician drained their loved one. Some doctors even saved the blood for inspection, swirling it in bowls to interpret its qualities. Thick, too much black bile. Thin, too much phlegm. Clotted, bad temperament. It was medicine as fortune-telling, with the patient paying for both the performance and the privilege of survival. And if you didn't faint on your own, the doctor could speed things up with a cupping glass. He'd heat the glass, press it against your skin, and watch as it sucked up flesh like a vacuum cleaner possessed. The result? Bruises that looked like you'd wrestled an octopus, and sometimes blisters filled with blood that could be lanced for extra effect. All of this was considered not only normal but desirable, evidence that the illness was being expelled, that the body was being purified, that the patient was finally on the road to health. The irony, of course, was brutal. For patients already weak from fever, dysentery or tuberculosis, losing a pint or two of blood was the medical equivalent of kicking over the last leg of a collapsing chair. Many never recovered. Records are filled with polite obituaries that whisper about complications, or the fever worsening, when in reality the cure had been the last blow. But medicine loves its rituals, and Victorians adored the drama of bloodletting. Picture the apothecary's window with its barber pole spirals, red and white stripes that originally symbolised blood and bandages, spinning like a carnival advertisement for sanctioned injury. Step inside, and the apothecary himself might double as a bleeder, his hands equally skilled with scissors and lancets. After all, what's a little blood between neighbours? Women, especially, were frequent victims. Doctors insisted their bodies were prone to congestion of the womb, the liver, the brain, essentially congestion everywhere except where it made sense. Bloodletting became a routine cure for menstrual irregularities, postpartum weakness, or the vague condition known as female hysteria. In practice, this meant many women already faint from corsets and laudanum were also bled until pallor and dizziness became their permanent companions. Society admired this look: fragile, pale, ethereal. Little did they realise they were admiring symptoms of medical sabotage. Sometimes the bleeding was repeated daily, or even multiple times a day, until patients could barely stand. One French physician proudly described bleeding a woman 39 times over the course of a single illness. He called it a triumph. She called it death. Even children weren't spared. Feverish infants were sometimes bled from the scalp or behind the ears, as though draining a thimbleful of blood could possibly cure a body still learning how to walk. Parents trusted this because the doctor said so, and because questioning authority in an era of waistcoats and beards was unthinkable. Now, picture yourself after the procedure. You're propped against pillows, the bandage tight around your arm, your head swimming with dizziness. The doctor beams, wiping his lancet with a cloth that has definitely seen better days. He insists you'll feel lighter tomorrow, and you probably will. Lighter in blood, lighter in energy, lighter in life expectancy. He gathers his things, pockets his payment, and strides out the door, satisfied with another successful evening of draining vitality in the name of healing. The family tiptoes back into the room, whispering about how pale you look. One relative suggests you're practically glowing. Another says you look like a ghost. They mean it as a compliment. You close your eyes, too weak to correct them, too weak to argue, too weak to do anything except drift into a half-sleep where dreams and fainting blur into one indistinguishable haze. And outside, the world keeps spinning. Carriages rattle by, fog clings to gas lamps, and in parlours across the city, other doctors are busy draining other patients, their bowls filling with crimson proof of their dedication. Somewhere another family praises the physician, another patient drifts into unconsciousness, another obituary is quietly written. For the Victorians, this wasn't cruelty, it was care. They believed wholeheartedly that illness was imbalance, that balance required subtraction, and that life itself was a delicate scale only doctors could keep steady. The fact that their scales often tipped toward death was an unfortunate detail, one politely ignored in the glow of confidence and ceremony. You lie there, ribs still squeezed by corset, belly still heavy with laudanum, veins still aching from the lancet's bite. Your body feels less like a home and more like an experiment, a collection of fluids and humours to be drained, poisoned or soothed depending on the doctor's mood that day. And you realise, perhaps for the first time, that in Victorian medicine, healing is not the absence of suffering. Healing is simply the art of surviving the cure. The fog outside your window is lifting, but inside the air still carries the scent of vinegar and damp linen. The doctor has left, though his absence doesn't mean safety. Tonight, the real danger is not in your own veins, but in the small cradle near the fire. A child lies restless, cheeks flushed with fever, whimpers rising into thin cries that break the silence like glass. And there, on the mantel, sits another bottle, smaller, cheerier, its label stamped with curly fonts that promise nothing but comfort. Godfrey's Cordial, also known in whispers as the mother's friend. You lift the bottle, feel the syrup slosh thickly inside, and you know what's in it. Opium, sugar, and a dash of treacle. A combination so deceptively innocent it was spooned into infants as casually as honey. In fact, mothers across Victorian England and America swore by it. Apothecaries sold it by the gallon, advertised it in newspapers, and handed it across counters without flinching. Soothes restlessness, quiets nerves, ensures peaceful sleep, the labels read. And it did. Too well. The cries of children were inconvenient in an era when most households juggled 5, 6, sometimes 10 little bodies under one roof. A baby who screamed all night was not just exhausting, it was disruptive. It frayed nerves, disturbed fathers' reading chairs, unsettled mothers already pressed into exhaustion by endless chores. And so, bottles like Godfrey's cordial or soothing syrup became saviours. One spoonful, and the cries dwindled. Another spoonful, and silence settled across the room, silence so complete it might be mistaken for grace. But silence is not always safety. These syrups quieted by shutting down little lungs, slowed, breathing dulled hunger. Babies forgot to cry not because they were content, but because their bodies were slipping towards stillness. Yet in a society that prized quiet obedience, in wives, in servants, in children, this seemed almost a blessing. Picture a weary mother in a London tenement. The air smells of coal smoke and boiled cabbage. The walls are thin, the noise from neighbours relentless. Her baby has been screaming for hours, the child's fever high, the cradle rocking without effect. She has no money for a doctor, no family nearby, no time left for rest. She lifts the cordial bottle, pours a spoonful, tips it gently into her baby's mouth. Minutes later, the child drifts into silence, tiny chest rising and falling slower now, eyes closed. The mother sighs with relief, whispers a prayer of thanks, and finally collapses into her own bed. She doesn't know, or perhaps doesn't dare think, what she has really given. This wasn't rare. By mid-century, opium-laced syrups were staples in working-class homes. They were cheap, effective, and legal. In some towns, they were sold right beside sugar and tea, and because illness struck often, teething pains, fevers, coughs, the bottles emptied quickly. Infants sometimes received daily doses, their bodies slowly reshaped by the drug until they were more shadow than flesh. Records from coroners' inquests are chilling. Infants dead in their cradles, stomachs full of laudanum or syrup, death ruled accidental but accepted as routine. Doctors knew, at least some of them. Medical journals occasionally published warnings, describing infants slipping into comas or wasting away. But these warnings were buried between enthusiastic articles about bloodletting or magnetic therapy, and mothers rarely read them. The apothecaries certainly didn't shout them from the rooftops. Why spoil a profitable product with inconvenient facts? And so, the bottles multiplied. Godfrey's cordial, Dalby's carminative, Winslow's soothing syrup. Each with its own branding, each marketed as essential to modern child-rearing. Advertisements showed cherubic babies, smiling mothers, slogans that promised peace. Nowhere did they show the infants buried in tiny coffins, their deaths chalked up to teething fever or failure to thrive. It's almost unbearable to picture, yet you must because it was reality. Imagine walking through a Victorian cemetery. Rows upon rows of small headstones, lambs carved into the stone, names barely etched before they faded in weather. Many of those infants were not lost to fate or disease, but to bottles handed over counters with cheerful smiles. Mother's friend, they called it. A friend who comforted by silence, who comforted by stillness, who comforted by letting children drift away without complaint. And it wasn't just infants. Older children, too, were given these syrups to keep them docile during long days when parents worked, at factories. A fidgety toddler in a cramped apartment might receive a spoonful before being left with siblings. A boy restless with cough might be dosed before church to ensure he didn't disrupt the sermon. A girl too lively for a quiet parlour might be softened into drowsiness with a teaspoon of syrup before guests arrived. Childhood itself, with its noise and demands, was drugged into passivity. The cruelty of it was unintentional, which in some ways makes it worse. Parents did not think they were harming their children. They believed they were caring, soothing, protecting. They trusted the labels, trusted the apothecaries, trusted the culture that told them quiet was health. And who could blame them? When doctors prescribed mercury for adults, why wouldn't opium for children be considered safe? If silence followed, wasn't that proof it was working? Back in your own sick room, the baby's cries falter as the syrup takes hold. The fire pops in the grate, the shadows lengthen, and for a moment you feel relief. The house is still. The neighbours cannot complain. The doctor, if he came, would nod approvingly. A peaceful child, he'd say. But beneath that peace, something is stolen. Childhood itself is dulled. Bright eyes dimmed, tiny voices hushed before they ever had the chance to fully sing. And yet, Victorian society admired it. Quiet children were praised as well-raised. Mothers with peaceful homes were envied. Fathers with silent nurseries boasted about order and discipline. No one thought to ask what price had been paid for the hush. There's a bitter irony here. The very era that adored sentimental paintings of children, cherubic faces framed in golden curls, also poisoned them in cradles with syrup disguised as kindness. The very century that idolized innocence also fed it narcotics. And because silence was the goal, in women, in servants, in children, society applauded the results. Your own eyelids grow heavy as you watch the baby sleep unnaturally still. You think of all the other rooms across the city, other fires burning low, other bottles tilted toward tiny mouths. The silence spreads house by house, street by street, until London itself seems muted, as though the fog has crept inside every nursery. It is not the silence of peace, but of suppression, the quiet of a world where medicine confuses absence of sound with health. The candle burns low, the cordial bottle gleams faintly, and you understand at last that Victorian medicine didn't just nearly kill you. It nearly killed everyone. Adults drained by leeches, women fainting in corsets, children drugged into stillness. The century itself seemed addicted to its own cures, and still the doctors smiled, still the apothecaries sold, still the families trusted. You close your eyes, listening to the unnatural quiet of the room, and wonder how many more bottles will be poured before anyone dares to question whether silence is really the same as safety. The doctor arrives again, though this time he does not bring a jar of leeches or a bottle of laudanum. Instead, he carries something smaller, wrapped in brown paper, tucked under his arm like a guilty secret. When he unfolds the paper on your bedside table, you see tiny packets of powder, white, shimmering faintly, with a label that looks more cosmetic than medicinal. Arsenic wafers. The words alone should make you shiver, but here in the Victorian age, they make hearts flutter instead. You see, arsenic was not just a poison, it was an aspiration. While newspapers occasionally reported gruesome murders committed with the stuff, apothecaries and beauty merchants sold it openly as a cure, as a tonic, as a path toward refinement. Women, in particular, were told that arsenic, in carefully measured doses, could lighten their complexions, smooth their skin, and create that faintly ghostly glow that society adored. Pale skin meant leisure, meant you weren't slaving in fields, meant refinement. A sickly pallor wasn't a warning sign, it was a fashion statement. The doctor nods toward the powder and assures you that a tiny dose will do wonders. He calls it cosmetic therapy. You call it suspiciously like slow-motion murder. But in an age when beauty and health were often considered the same thing, arsenic became a trusted ally. Imagine the delicate ritual. Women mixing a pinch into water, sipping it daily, grimacing at the taste, but admiring the results weeks later as their cheeks grew paler. Their eyes appeared larger in contrast. Their hair seemed shinier. What they didn't notice, or perhaps chose not to, was the cost. Arsenic built itself into the body like an unwanted lodger. Hair began to fall in strands. Fingernails became brittle. Stomachs churned with relentless nausea. Skin, though pale, also grew blotchy, sometimes covered with sores. And those pale, luminous faces so admired at the opera were sometimes only luminous, because they reflected the slow poisoning taking place beneath. But fashion rarely listens to science, and Victorian fashion listened least of all. Advertisements in magazines praised arsenic soaps, arsenic wafers, arsenic tonics. There were even entire arsenic complexes marketed for slimming the figure, as though consuming poison could sculpt the body into elegance. To be fair, it did slim the figure, mostly by shrinking the appetite and ensuring you couldn't keep down much food. Nothing says healthy silhouette like starvation disguised as beauty. Picture a young woman preparing for a ball. She sits at her vanity, candlelight reflecting off the glass. Her maid brings the powder, mixes it carefully, and hands it to her. She sips, winces, and then applies arsenic-based face powder to her cheeks as well, layering poison on poison like icing on a lethal cake. Hours later, she descends the staircase, her complexion glowing unnaturally pale, her suitors whispering about her, ethereal beauty. No one comments on the tremor in her hands, the weakness in her step, the way her smile is fixed too tightly. To them, she is perfection. To her body, she is an experiment in endurance. Even stranger, some doctors supported this openly. They believed that arsenic in small doses stimulated the system, purging impurities, calming nerves, even improving digestion. The fact that it also caused vomiting, diarrhea, and eventual organ failure was explained away as the body adapting. Victorians adored the concept of purging. If something came out, whether blood, bile, or vomit, surely that meant health was on its way in. By this logic, arsenic became a miracle worker until it killed you. The poor, too, encountered arsenic in everyday life, though often less deliberately. Arsenic was used to dye fabrics, to tint wallpapers, to create pigments in paints. A nursery papered in a cheerful green might slowly emit arsenic dust into the air, settling into lungs as children played. A fashionable gown, dyed a brilliant emerald, might rub against skin during a waltz, leaving behind rashes that never healed. Guests at dinner parties admired these colours without realising they were applauding poison clinging to every surface. And oh, how Victorians adored green. Shields green and Paris green, arsenic-based pigments, covered everything from ball gowns to toy soldiers. Picture a child chewing idly on a painted toy, swallowing flecks of arsenic between bites of bread. Picture a hostess proud of her wallpaper, only to find her servants coughing blood in the halls. The connection wasn't always obvious. After all, how could beauty itself be dangerous? But the evidence was there, quietly tallying lives in cemeteries. Your own doctor, oblivious or willfully blind, offers you a wafer with that same paternal smile. For your nerves, he insists, for your complexion. You swallow, the powder bitter on your tongue, and feel a faint burn in your stomach. He doesn't notice your grimace, too busy scribbling another note about the wonders of modern medicine. Outside, society continues the charade. Arsenic on faces, arsenic in walls, arsenic in gowns, arsenic in daily lives. There's a cruel irony here, isn't there? That women were praised for their ghostly beauty while literally turning into ghosts. That doctors prescribed toxins while congratulating themselves on progress. That society adored fragility so much it cultivated it deliberately, even when fragility was just another word for dying. And yet, no one questioned it. The pale look was admired, the advertisements persuasive, the bottles plentiful. To refuse arsenic was to risk looking robust, healthy, perhaps even ruddy. Qualities linked not to refinement but to labour, to poverty, to shame. Better to glow faintly in sickness than to risk being mistaken for ordinary. Back in your sick room, the arsenic does its work. Your head feels light, your stomach uneasy, your hands faintly trembling. The doctor nods approvingly, tucks the packet back into his bag and promises more tomorrow. He leaves satisfied, footsteps fading down the hall, and you lie back against your pillows, wondering how many of your neighbours are taking the same poison, how many children are sleeping beneath arsenic-tinted walls, how many women are sipping their way toward beauty one dose at a time. The candle flickers, casting greenish shadows against the wallpaper. You blink, dizzy, and realise that in the Victorian world, health was not the absence of illness. Health was simply the performance of beauty, even if that performance came at the price of your life. The doctor returns once more, but tonight his bag looks heavier, and the expression on his face is even more serious than usual, which is impressive, considering he always looks like a man rehearsing for a funeral. He sits down at your bedside, clears his throat, and informs you that the time has come for something more decisive. Not powders, not syrups, not even leeches. Tonight's prescription is surgery. Now, before you picture white walls, sterile gloves, and clean silver scalpels gleaming under electric lamps, erase that entirely. A Victorian operation is closer to carpentry than medicine. The tools, long knives, bone saws, rusty forceps. The preparation, a wipe on a handkerchief, and if you're lucky, a splash of brandy. The anaesthesia, often non-existent. For much of the early century, surgery was simply a matter of speed. The faster the surgeon, the better your chances of survival. Patients weren't measured by how well they healed, but by how long they could scream before fainting. Imagine the room. No operating theatres yet, no neat rows of scrubbed instruments. Instead, you are moved to a wooden table dragged near the fire. The surgeon, because in this context the doctor becomes more butcher than healer, rolls up his sleeves. His assistants hold you down firmly, whispering assurances that sound less like comfort and more like apologies. Outside the door, family members hover, praying fervently. Inside, the air smells of sweat, alcohol, and iron. If you're fortunate, chloroform or ether might be on hand. These anaesthetics were slowly making their way into hospitals and homes, hailed as miraculous when they worked, feared as fatal when they didn't. Too much, and you stopped breathing. Too little, and you woke up mid-sore. Imagine inhaling a cloth soaked in chloroform, the sharp chemical sting burning your nose and throat, your mind growing foggy. For a moment, you feel relief. Then darkness. Then, if the dose isn't enough, a sudden sharp awareness that someone is slicing into you. Surgeons prided themselves on speed. Amputation of a leg could be done in under 3 minutes by a practiced hand. The record, depending on which gory tale you believe, was under 30 seconds. Picture it. A team saw buzzing furiously through bone, assistants catching the limb before it hit the floor, the patient screaming or unconscious, the surgeon wiping his brow with satisfaction. Applause sometimes followed. Yes, applause. Because in hospitals, surgeries were often performed in front of audiences. Medical students crowded the galleries like spectators at a macabre theatre, cheering their professors as though they were actors in a grisly play. Of course, speed didn't guarantee survival. The lack of antiseptics meant infection lurked like an unseen executioner. Surgeons wore the same coats for years, each one stiff with layers of dried blood. A badge of honour, proof of experience. Washing hands between patients was laughable. It wasted time, and besides, germs were not yet fully believed in. Knives might be wiped on trousers, saws left on wooden tables until the next case. Imagine lying there, wound, freshly bandaged, only to discover days later that fever, pus and sepsis had crept in. Many patients died not from the blade but from what came after. Back in your sick room, the surgeon explains the necessity. Perhaps your leg is diseased, perhaps your abdomen inflamed, perhaps your tooth rotting. Whatever the case, he insists only the knife can save you now. You swallow hard, glance at the tools glinting in the candlelight, and realise your chances are 50-50 at best. Either you walk away, well, limp away, or you don't wake at all. And yet, Victorians lined up for surgery. They trusted the knife, feared it, revered it. In hospitals like St Bartholomew's or Guy's in London, crowds gathered for operations, students learning, patients praying, surgeons racing against pain. The bravest patients were celebrated, their names whispered with respect. The ones who died became cautionary tales, and through it all, the knife gleamed. Consider dental surgery. No neat chairs, no humming drills, just a burly dentist gripping forceps like pliers, yanking teeth with the force of a blacksmith. No anaesthesia, no numbing gel. You sat, you clenched, you screamed, you bled, and afterward you might be handed a laudanum bottle for the pain, which, as you now know, was simply trading one torment for another. There's a dark comedy to it all. Surgeons competed for reputation, measuring themselves by speed and daring. Patients prayed for steady hands, though steady often meant fast rather than careful. Infection hovered over every wound like a vulture, but because it arrived days later, no one blamed the surgeon. They blamed the patient's constitution, or fate, or God. The surgeon pocketed his fee, the family buried their dead, and the system rolled on. Later in the century, Joseph Lister began championing antiseptic surgery, insisting on carbolic acid washes, sterilised instruments, cleaner environments. He was mocked at first. Other surgeons laughed at his obsession with cleanliness, calling him fussy, prissy, paranoid. Imagine that of being ridiculed for washing your hands. But slowly, grudgingly, the proof emerged. Fewer infections, fewer deaths, more survivors. By the end of the century, Lister's methods began to win. But for decades before, Surgery was less about healing and more about gambling. Back in your bed, you shiver at the thought of being lifted to that wooden table. The doctor assures you it's safe. He's done it many times. He neglects to mention how many of those times ended with funerals. The assistants prepare cloths, the instruments glint, and you realise that in the Victorian world survival often depended less on medicine and more on sheer luck. Outside, the city hums on. Somewhere, a patient limps from an amputation, grateful to be alive despite the phantom pain. Somewhere else, a mother weeps as infection claims her child days after a successful surgery. Surgeons wipe their knives, adjust their coats, and move on to the next case. Progress, they call it. You might call it a nightmare dressed in waistcoats and sawdust. The candle flickers, shadows stretch long across the walls, and you know that if tonight is the night of the knife, you must put your faith not in medicine but in fortune, because in Victorian surgery healing was never guaranteed, only speed, pain, and a hope that infection might pass you by. Tonight, the doctor comes not with saws or scalpels, nor with arsenic powders or cordial syrups, but with something that hums faintly and rattles in his bag. When he pulls it free, the contraption looks like a cross between a fishing reel and an unfortunate clock. Brass coils gleam, wires dangle, and two metal handles wait like sinister invitations. He beams as he sets it down, declaring proudly that you are about to experience the miracle of electricity. Victorian medicine adored electricity. It was new, mysterious, glamorous. If lightning could split trees and light up skies, surely it could also fix nerves, heal paralysis, and banish depression. Never mind that no one truly understood how it worked. Details are for pedants. Doctors and quacks alike embraced it, selling devices that promised to restore vigour with a few harmless zaps. Harmless, of course, being relative. The doctor dips the handles into a shallow dish of water, then hands them to you. Hold tight, he says, twisting a dial with theatrical flair. At once a sharp jolt runs through your arms, your fingers clench, your shoulders spasm. Your hair prickles, your teeth ache, your toes curl. He nods sagely. Excellent. The nerves are awakening. Translation: you're being electrocuted in your nightgown. Electricity was marketed for everything. Nervous exhaustion? A little shock to perk you up. Male impotence? Apply electrodes to the relevant regions, an image you should not linger on. Female hysteria? Run the current gently through delicate bodies until they either fainted or, in the doctor's proud words, recovered their composure. Even baldness was targeted. A shock to the scalp, they promised, would stimulate hair like grass after rain. In reality, it often stimulated nothing but burns. Quack inventors made fortunes selling these machines. Electrogalvanic belts promised men endless vigour. Magnetic corsets guaranteed women stronger spines. Entire catalogues filled with devices you could strap to your arms, legs, or unmentionables, all buzzing faintly, all marketed as the future of health. For the Victorians, who were half in love with science and half enslaved to superstition, electricity seemed divine, a force invisible, powerful, eternal. Why wouldn't it heal? Imagine the parlour demonstrations. A travelling salesman rolls in his machine, cranks the handle and produces sparks that make ladies squeal, and gentlemen lean forward with fascination. Volunteers are asked to step up. A woman touches the metal and jerks back with a gasp. Her hair suddenly haloed with static. The audience claps. The salesman bows. A taste of the cure, he proclaims. Orders are placed, purses opened, coins clinking onto the table. Who cares if the cure feels suspiciously like sticking your finger in a socket? The machines came in all sizes, some small enough to fit in a box under your bed, others large enough to dominate a room. They were advertised, with diagrams of currents flowing gracefully through the human body, as though electricity behaved like a polite guest, choosing only to invigorate tired muscles and never, say, to fry them. For every success story, a man claiming his nerves no longer trembled, a woman declaring her melancholy lifted. There were countless failures, quietly ignored, buried under more advertising. And magnetism joined the parade. If electricity was divine, magnetism was mystical. Magnets embedded in belts, bracelets and corsets promised to realign energies, strengthen the blood, even ward off disease. Fashionable women wore them beneath gowns. Fashionable men strapped them across torsos. The idea was that invisible forces of the earth could be coaxed into healing, like a cosmic tide flowing through your veins. The reality was less tide and more placebo. But the Victorians, desperate for comfort in a world of arsenic and leashes, clung to anything that sounded modern. Back in your sick room, the doctor continues his demonstration. He moves the handles from your hands to your temples, adjusting the dial. Your head jerks. A flash of white light bursts behind your eyes, and for a moment you are convinced your soul has been evicted from your skull. He smiles proudly. Splendid response. He scribbles in his notebook, ignoring the fact that your vision now contains more sparks than the fireplace. It wasn't all folly. A few genuine medical uses of electricity did exist. Crude defibrillation attempts, for instance, or experimental nerve stimulation. But these were rare, overshadowed by the spectacle of quackery. Electricity was too mysterious, too tempting to resist turning into theatre. Doctors became magicians, machines became props, patients became willing spectators in their own electrocution. Consider the electropathic belt, one of the most infamous devices. Advertisements promised it would cure everything from back pain to impotence. It looked like a leather strap studded with metal discs worn snugly around the waist. Instructions advised wearing it for hours each day. Some belts even required wet sponges soaked in vinegar to conduct the charge, leaving wearers not only tingling but smelling like pickled onions. And yet they sold by the thousands. Men swore their strength returned, women swore their nerves calmed, and salesmen swore their profits soared. Meanwhile, magnetism seeped into domestic life. Magnets sewn into mattresses, magnets slipped into shoes, magnets placed under pillows. The idea was that sleeping in a magnetic field realigned your body's energies. Patients swore they felt lighter, calmer, more vigorous. Science swore they were imagining it. But in an age when imagination was sometimes all people had, perhaps that was enough. The greatest irony was that the Victorians adored electricity while ignoring cleanliness. They would happily shock themselves nightly with buzzing belts, but scoff at washing their hands before meals. Invisible forces were thrilling, invisible germs were ridiculous. Sparks earned applause, soap earned sneers. Back in your room, the session ends. The doctor winds down his machine, coils the wires, tucks it neatly back into his bag. Your arms still tingle. Your jaw aches from clenching, and your hair has developed a personality of its own. He pats your shoulder with satisfaction, declaring the treatment a success. You collapse against your pillows, half convinced you've just wrestled with lightning itself. Outside, London flickers with real electricity. Arc lamps glow in new streets. Telegraphs buzz with messages. Factories hum with power. The city is alive with currents, both in wires and in bodies. And somewhere, in hundreds of sick rooms, patients clutch electrodes, squirm under magnetic corsets, and convince themselves that healing has finally arrived. The candle sputters, your limbs still twitch faintly, and you understand what electricity meant to the Victorians. Not a cure, not really, but a promise. A spark of hope in a world otherwise filled with leeches, poisons, and knives. Hope that sometimes hurt as much as it healed, but hope nonetheless. The fog outside has thickened again, but in here, the true weight pressing against your chest is not mist. It's the shadow of the asylum. Tonight the doctor speaks less about fevers and nerves, less about leeches and laudanum, and more about the mind, or more precisely about what happens when the mind misbehaves. He lowers his voice as though discussing scandal, and in a way he is. For Victorians, mental illness was not an illness. It was a threat, an embarrassment, a reason to be locked away where polite society couldn't see it. You feel his gaze weigh heavily, perhaps too heavily, as he mutters about nervous agitation. Maybe you cried too long yesterday. Maybe your laughter came too quick today. Maybe your cough has made you irritable. It doesn't matter. The verdict is the same. You are fragile, unstable, hysterical, and in this century hysteria is not just a diagnosis, It's practically a lifestyle category. Asylums rose across the landscape like grim cathedrals of despair. Tall brick walls, barred windows, heavy doors. Inside, corridors echoed with the cries of the disturbed, the moans of the forgotten. Officially, they were hospitals for the insane. Unofficially, they were warehouses for the inconvenient. Wives who spoke too boldly, daughters who resisted marriage, sons who drank too much, mothers who grieved too long. Families could sign a paper, pay a fee, and be rid of a troublesome relative by nightfall. For their health, of course. Always for their health. Imagine walking through one. The air damp, the stench of unwashed bodies thick, the sound of chains clinking faintly down the hall. Some patients paced endlessly, muttering to themselves, while others sat slumped in corners, eyes empty, minds dulled by medication. Iron restraints clamped around wrists, leather straps bound bodies to benches, and in the background attendants carried out treatments that blurred the line between therapy and punishment. For women, hysteria was the great catch-all. Symptoms included weeping, silence, anger, laughter, fainting, dreaming, reading novels, or simply existing with too much visible energy. Doctors debated its causes with seriousness bordering on comedy, wandering wombs, weak nerves, excessive education. Treatments ranged from rest cures, weeks confined to bed with no books, no conversation, no stimulation, to pelvic massages administered by physicians who swore they were providing medical relief. The reality, a mixture of boredom, humiliation and dependency, packaged as therapy. Consider the rest cure more closely. Imagine lying in bed for 6 weeks, forbidden to rise except to use a chamber pot, your meals brought to you on trays, your visitors limited, your books taken away. You're told to avoid thinking, to avoid writing, to avoid even knitting. The purpose? To quiet your mind, strengthen your body, and restore your feminine grace. In practice, it drove many patients into deeper despair. Charlotte Perkins Gilman captured it perfectly in her short story, The Yellow Wallpaper, a thinly veiled scream against the rest cure that mirrored her own life. Men too ended up in asylums, though their sins were labelled differently. Alcoholism, violence, gambling, melancholy, all could earn confinement. Treatments included cold baths so frigid they numbed skin raw, blistering of the scalp to release pressure, or the spinning chair in which patients were strapped down and rotated until vomiting provided supposed relief. One can only marvel at the logic. If someone is already unstable, why not add dizziness and nausea to the mix? And always, laudanum lurked nearby. Patients were dosed into docility, their outbursts softened, their protests muted. Some swallowed willingly, desperate for any comfort. Others resisted, only to find the liquid forced between clenched teeth. Addiction bloomed in the cells of the asylum as easily as in the parlours of the rich, but here it carried no glamour, no lace curtains, only silence. Back in your room, the doctor explains all this with that same rehearsed authority. He suggests, gently but firmly, that perhaps you would benefit from a little retreat, a place where the noise of the city won't trouble you, where specialists can supervise your nerves. He calls it a sanitarium. You imagine stone walls, iron gates, the sound of doors locking behind you. You think of the women who entered for rest and never came out, their families eventually announcing their deaths as politely as one might announce a change of address. The cruelty of the asylum was not always deliberate. Some physicians truly believed they were helping. They introduced moral therapy, encouraging patients to work in gardens, to sew, to read scripture, to find order in routine. For a few it worked. For many, it simply layered fresh expectations onto broken minds. Others, less kindly, treated patients as curiosities. Wealthy visitors toured asylums like they were zoos, peering at the lunatics through bars, pointing, whispering, laughing. Imagine being ill, trapped, forgotten, and then paraded for strangers' amusement. And yet, Victorians feared the asylum almost as much as they trusted it. It was the threat always hovering. Step out of line, behave too strangely, and whispers began. Perhaps she needs a rest. Perhaps he should be admitted. The asylum became a boogeyman, a looming presence reminding everyone to keep their madness private, their grief polite, their eccentricities masked. Better to sip laudanum quietly at home than risk the clang of asylum doors. You glance at the doctor, at the little notebook in which he scribbles, at the way his eyes flicker toward you as though measuring your stability. Perhaps he has already decided. Perhaps the next knock at your door will not be a visit but a removal. The thought chills you more than any fever. Because in the Victorian world, madness was not understood. It was not treated with compassion. It was managed, contained, silenced. And in those brick walls, those long corridors, those barred rooms, countless voices were lost. Not because they were mad, but because they were inconvenient. Outside, the fog clings tighter to the windows. Somewhere, in another part of the city, a carriage rattles toward an asylum, carrying a passenger who does not know if they will ever come out again. Somewhere else, a woman lies in bed, ordered to rest, her mind unravelling in boredom. Somewhere else, a doctor straps a patient into a spinning chair, convinced that dizziness will cure despair. And here you lie, your heart heavy, your nerves trembling, wondering if tomorrow's cure will be another bottle, another lancet, or the iron key of an asylum door. The candle burns lower tonight, but you're not alone. The doctor is here again with his black bag of conviction, though his tone has shifted. No longer is he muttering about laudanum or leeches or electricity. Tonight his focus is war, a quiet war, fought not with scalpels but with words, against the midwives who once held sway over every berth and bedchamber. For centuries, women had turned to women for care. Midwives were woven into the fabric of communities, called at all hours to assist with childbirth, fevers, childhood ailments, and the quiet struggles of women's bodies. They carried herbal knowledge, folk remedies, steady hands, and experience passed from one generation to the next. They were not perfect, but they were present. They knew their neighbours, their patients, their craft. But the 19th century changed everything. Men in medicine, armed with degrees, instruments, and above all authority, began to push midwives out. They declared them ignorant, unscientific, dangerous. They claimed the mantle of professionalism, wrapping themselves in Latin and waistcoats, building a fortress of credibility that midwives could not easily scale. Hospitals and medical colleges spread, and with them came the slow erasure of women from healing. Picture a young mother in London labouring in a dim room. Once she would have had a midwife by her side, whispering encouragement, mixing herbs, guiding her through pain with the wisdom of 100 births behind her. Now a man arrives in a stiff collar, bringing forceps that gleam like instruments of torture. He speaks with authority, but his experience may be thin. After all, male doctors were often barred from attending women's labours during training, and yet he believes himself superior. He insists upon his methods. If the birth goes well, he claims credit. If it does not, he blames the woman or the midwife who lingered too near. Forceps became the symbol of this new era, heavy, cold, frightening, designed to grip the infant's head and pull it into the world when nature faltered. In skilled hands, they saved lives. In unskilled ones, they broke skulls, crushed spines, left mothers torn and bleeding, and many Victorian doctors were unskilled, rushing from patient to patient, convinced of their brilliance, unwilling to admit failure. Midwives looked on helplessly, their knowledge dismissed, their warnings ignored. The struggle wasn't only about childbirth. Midwives had long been community healers, trusted for everything from herbal contraceptives to poultices for wounds. But as medicine professionalised, laws tightened. Apothecaries refused to supply them. Courts accused them of witchcraft or malpractice. Medical men lobbied for licences only they could hold, pushing women further to the margins. What had once been partnership became conquest. And the consequences were brutal. In hospitals, where men increasingly took charge of births, a silent killer spread: puerperal fever. Women delivered by physicians often died days later, racked with infection. Midwives working in homes saw lower rates. Why? Because midwives washed their hands, not out of scientific knowledge but habit, cleanliness, respect. Doctors meanwhile marched from autopsies to birthing beds without pause, their instruments unwashed, their coats stiff with dried blood. They called infection miasma or fate, never considering their own hands as culprits, and so women died in droves, sacrificed to pride. Consider the tragic irony. Male doctors accused midwives of ignorance while spreading death with their own ignorance. They boasted of progress while refusing to listen, and society believed them, because authority wore trousers, not aprons. Back in your sick room, the doctor speaks confidently about the decline of midwifery. He describes it as inevitable, the march of science, the triumph of professionalism. You wonder, quietly, if professional means safer or simply louder. He tucks his notebook away, satisfied that another lecture has been delivered, another patient reminded of who holds authority here. But outside, the battle raged. Midwives resisted, some joining nursing movements, others fighting for recognition. Women like Florence Nightingale elevated nursing to a new respectability, though always carefully framed as supportive to male doctors, never independent. Others continued quietly, attending births in rural villages, carrying their herbs, their whispered prayers, their stubborn refusal to vanish. Yet the tide was against them. By the end of the century, male doctors dominated childbirth, midwives relegated to the shadows. The consequences stretched far beyond mortality. Childbirth, once a communal, female-centred event, became clinical, hierarchical, controlled. Women surrendered their bodies not just to labour, but to authority. Their knowledge was dismissed, their voices silenced, their roles rewritten. Picture again that young mother. She screams in pain, the doctor fumbles with forceps, the infant is pulled free, blood-soaking sheets. The mother weakens, fever sets in days later. The midwife who might have comforted her has been barred from the room. The family bows to the doctor's authority, though grief whispers otherwise. And in the cemetery, another small grave appears, another mother gone, another victory chalked up to progress. The candle flickers in your own room as you imagine it all. The faces of midwives lined with years of care dismissed as superstition. The faces of doctors smooth and confident, their hands carrying death unnoticed. The slow replacement of community with hierarchy, of partnership with dominance. And you realise that Victorian medicine was not simply about cures or poisons, it was about power. Who gets to heal? Who gets to decide? Who gets to define what counts as knowledge? And who gets erased? The doctor gathers his bag, tips his hat and leaves. The silence he leaves behind feels heavier than the fog. You lie back, staring at the ceiling, and wonder whether you would rather trust the herbs of a midwife or the forceps of a man who never washed his hands. Neither choice feels safe, but one feels human. The rain hammers against the glass tonight, and the streets beyond your window glisten with the reflections of gas lamps, their weak halos struggling against the fog. Inside you cough, but this time the doctor does not blame your nerves or your womb, or even your appetite for arsenic wafers. No, tonight he blames the city itself. He leans close, his breath heavy with pipe smoke, and mutters a word that chills Victorian households everywhere: cholera. If there was one enemy that revealed the failures of Victorian medicine more than any lancet or laudanum bottle, it was the great epidemics. Cholera, typhus, smallpox, scarlet fever. Diseases that spread not because bodies were weak, but because the world around them was poisoned. And nowhere was that poison more visible than in the water. Picture the Thames in 1850. Not the stately, picturesque river of paintings, but a heaving soup of human waste, industrial runoff, rotting carcasses and chemical dyes. The city's sewers emptied directly into it, and from it, water was drawn again to drink. Londoners joked that the river had flavour. The reality was more sinister. It carried death in every gulp. Families scooped buckets of it for tea, never realising the brownish tint was more than just silt. Doctors, still clinging to theories of miasma, bad air, insisted the danger came from the smell, not the liquid itself. And so they pinched their noses and carried on drinking poison. When cholera struck, it did so brutally. Patients went from health to collapse in a matter of hours. Vomiting, diarrhoea, cramps, skin turning a ghastly shade of blue as dehydration set in. Families watched loved ones shrink into husks, writhing in pain, dying within a day. Doctors tried everything: laudanum to calm the stomach, bleeding to balance humours, mustard poultices to draw out the poison. None of it worked. Streets filled with death carts, cemeteries overflowed, panic spread. And yet, the true cause lay right beneath their feet. It was John Snow. No, not the fictional one with dragons, but the physician, who finally proved that cholera came from contaminated water. He traced outbreaks to specific pumps, most famously the Broad Street pump in Soho. When he removed its handle, the epidemic slowed. But his discovery clashed with the entrenched miasma theory, and many doctors scoffed. Invisible germs in water? Nonsense. Foul odours were the real villain. People preferred to blame the smell than admit their tea was brewed in sewage. Typhus too haunted the poor. Spread by lice, it thrived in overcrowded tenements where dozens crammed into damp, windowless rooms. The fever burned high, delirium followed, death often came quickly. Doctors offered little more than sympathy, sometimes bleeding patients who already lacked strength. Putrid fever, they called it, as if renaming it might soften the horror. And then there was smallpox, scarred into the very skin of the century. The vaccine existed, thanks to Edward Jenner, but suspicion and poor distribution kept it from saving as many lives as it might have. Anti-vaccination leagues sprang up, claiming government conspiracies, mocking the idea of cowpox inoculation. Meanwhile, the unvaccinated fell ill, their faces pocked, their bodies fevered, their families devastated. Quarantines were half-hearted, sanitation nearly non-existent, and outbreaks continued to rage. Public health failures were not confined to London. Across industrial cities, Manchester, Liverpool, Birmingham, the story repeated. Open sewers ran beside houses, privies overflowed, cesspools leaked into wells. Rats scurried freely, fleas thrived, flies buzzed over waste. The poor lived knee-deep in filth, while the wealthy wrinkled their noses from behind lace curtains, insisting illness was caused by moral weakness rather than the environment. Imagine the tenements. Damp brick walls sweating with condensation. Straw pallets laid side by side, children coughing through the night. In the morning, mothers carried buckets of foul water up narrow stairs, boiled it for tea, and hoped the fever would spare them one more day. When cholera came, it tore through these homes like fire through tinder. Doctors arrived too late, armed with laudanum bottles and optimism, and left just as quickly, defeated but still certain they were right about bad airs. And yet slowly, painfully, reform crept in. The great stink of 1858, when the Thames grew so foul that Parliament itself could no longer bear the stench, finally forced action. Joseph Bazalgette designed vast new sewer systems, carving tunnels beneath the city to carry waste away. Fresh water supplies improved, sanitation laws tightened, and gradually the epidemics receded. But the cost had already been immense. Thousands dead, countless lives scarred by grief, entire neighbourhoods hollowed. Your doctor, of course, doesn't frame it that way. He insists his profession did its best, that bleeding and laudanum were noble attempts, that families simply lack the strength to endure. He never admits that his own hands, unwashed after the last patient, may have carried typhus from house to house. He never admits that hospitals themselves often became nests of infection, their wards crowded, their sheets unwashed, their air heavy with disease. Back in your room, you sip water from a jug, and you wonder where it came from. A well? A pump? A pipe drawn straight from the river? The candlelight glints off its surface, innocent, transparent, and deadly. You remember the stories of families felled in a single week, neighbours whispering about curses while the real curse lay in every cup of tea. You remember the cemeteries, rows upon rows of stones, tiny graves for children who never survived their first fever. And yet the city carried on. Markets bustled, factories roared, theatres filled. Life continued because it had to, because grief was constant, because mourning could not stop the machinery of progress. Public health remained the poor cousin of medicine, overlooked until stench and statistics made it impossible to ignore. Tonight, as you lie in bed, you can almost hear the echo of the city outside, water pumps squeaking, sewage trickling, carts rumbling over cobblestones carrying away the dead. The air in your room is quiet, but the silence feels uneasy, as if every drop in your jug carries its own secret. You close your eyes, and for a moment you imagine the pumps falling silent, the rivers running clear, the fever fading. But when you open them again, the jug still gleams in the candlelight, and you know that in Victorian medicine danger was not just in the cure, it was in the very air you breathed and the water you drank. The fog presses against your window panes like a damp curtain, but inside, your doctor is in high spirits. Tonight he has not brought knives or leeches, nor does he mutter about sewers or laudanum. No, tonight he carries an armful of bottles and pamphlets, each more dazzlingly labelled than the last. Gold letters, swirling fonts, illustrations of radiant women and heroic men beam at you from the glass. Miracle tonic, one says. Guaranteed cure, declares another. The doctor clears his throat and presents them with a flourish, as though unveiling jewels. Victorian medicine, for all its talk of science, was built just as much on spectacle and salesmanship. Patent medicines, unregulated, untested, but ferociously advertised, filled every shop window and newspaper column. They promised cures for everything: coughs, colds, cholera, baldness, gout, hysteria, indigestion, melancholy. Their ingredients, however, were less miraculous. Alcohol, opium, chloroform, arsenic, cocaine, the greatest hits of 19th century pharmacology, bottled and sweetened for mass consumption. Imagine the apothecary's shop, its shelves glittering like a sweet shop for adults. Bottles in amber, green and clear glass catch the candlelight. Labels boast of exotic origins: Peruvian bark elixir, Egyptian healing balm, Oriental nerve wine. Behind the counter, the apothecary smiles knowingly, pocketing coins as he assures desperate customers that this tonic is medically endorsed and universally approved. Few bother to ask who did the endorsing or what exactly universal approval means. Advertising was everything. Newspapers brimmed with testimonials, glowing letters allegedly from grateful patients, though suspiciously similar in handwriting. Posters showed cherubic children clutching bottles of syrup, their cheeks rosy, their eyes bright. Safe for infants, the captions promised, neglecting to mention the high concentration of morphine in each dose. Travelling salesmen staged demonstrations claiming to cure lameness with a sip, blindness with a drop, heartbreak with a spoonful. Crowds applauded, purses opened, bottles sold, and people bought them because what else was there? Doctors charged dearly, hospitals terrified, epidemics raged unchecked. A bottle of syrup or elixir felt like control, like hope you could hold in your hands. For a penny or two you could buy not just medicine, but the illusion of safety. Some tonics gained legendary status. Lydia Pinkham's vegetable compound, marketed to women for female complaints, became a household name. Its formula, largely alcohol flavoured with herbs. Women swore it eased menstrual pain and menopausal symptoms. In reality, it simply took the edge off, the same way a glass of gin might. But in a world where doctors often dismissed women's suffering as hysteria, Lydia Pinkham became both healer and heroine, her face smiling serenely from every bottle. Others were less benign. Chlorodyne, a wildly popular remedy for coughs and diarrhea, combined chloroform, morphine and cannabis. It worked, in the sense that it knocked you unconscious long enough to forget your bowels. Addiction, overdose, and sudden death were frequent side effects, but advertisements never mentioned those. Instead, they boasted of immediate relief, and households stocked it eagerly. Quack devices joined the parade. Magnetic brushes promised to stimulate hair growth. Liver pads, cloths soaked in mysterious chemicals, claimed to draw out toxins simply by resting against your skin. Some even sold radium water, glowing faintly with radioactive charm, said to invigorate the body. Customers drank it by the glass, marvelling at the tingling sensation, unaware it was slowly dismantling their bones. Fraud flourished because regulation was almost non-existent. Anyone could bottle a concoction, slap on a label and sell it as cure-all. The law rarely interfered, unless outright poisoning became too obvious to ignore. Even then, trials often ended with the seller lightly scolded rather than jailed. Profit spoke louder than truth. Back in your sick room, the doctor uncorks a bottle of tonic, the sharp scent of alcohol filling the air. He pours a measure into a glass and hands it to you. This will strengthen the constitution, invigorate the nerves, and banish melancholy, he promises. You sip, the liquid burning down your throat, warming your stomach, fuzzing the edges of your mind. Within minutes you do feel better, lighter, calmer, almost cheerful. Perhaps it is working after all. Then again, perhaps it's just the pint of brandy disguised as medicine. It wasn't only adults who partook. Children were dosed with soothing syrups containing morphine, babies given teething powders laced with opium, schoolboys sent off with tonics fortified with cocaine. Families trusted the labels, trusted the testimonials, trusted the authority of advertisements. The idea of questioning seemed unthinkable. After all, if it were dangerous, surely someone would stop it. But who would? Newspapers relied on patent medicine advertisements for revenue. Doctors sometimes partnered with quacks for a share of profits. Even clergy praised tonics from their pulpits, citing them as gifts of providence. Whole economies leaned on bottles of poison disguised as panacea. And yet, beneath the glitter, cracks showed. Addicts wandered streets, trembling hands clutching empty bottles. Families buried infants silenced too quickly by soothing syrups. Coroners noted the pattern but lacked power to intervene. Whispers of fraud grew louder, though they rarely outweighed the roar of profits. Still, reform stirred. By the late century, medical journals began exposing quacks more boldly, demanding stricter controls. Campaigners pushed for labelling laws, insisting that people deserved to know what they were swallowing. It would take decades, but eventually regulations tightened, bottles required ingredients, and some of the deadliest concoctions vanished from shelves. But for most of the Victorian age, the marketplace was a carnival of deception, each bottle a lottery ticket between relief and ruin. Back in your room, the doctor replaces the cork, tucks the bottle into his bag, and scribbles in his notebook. You feel warm, sleepy, oddly euphoric. For a moment, you believe he has saved you. Then your stomach churns, your head spins, and you remember that salvation in this century often comes with a hangover. The candle sputters, shadows flicker, and you drift towards sleep, your veins humming faintly with alcohol, your mind lulled into believing that medicine and miracle are the same thing. And outside, the city glows with advertisements pasted on walls, promising cures in every bottle, salvation in every sip. Somewhere, a mother doses her child. Somewhere, a salesman hawks his elixir in a crowded market. Somewhere, another household prays their bottle will heal rather than harm. The night grows darker, the fog thicker, but the labels shine brighter than truth. The rain has slowed, but the air inside your room is heavier than ever, thick with the scent of damp plaster and old smoke. Tonight, when the doctor steps in, there is no tonic bottle gleaming like amber, no crackling electrical contraption, no packets of shimmering powders. Instead, he holds a small leather-bound book, its pages worn, its corners curled, as if it has been carried into countless rooms before yours. He sets it down gently on the table, leans back in his chair, and tells you with grave pride that medicine is finally changing. At last, he insists, the invisible causes of disease are beginning to be understood. For centuries, illness had been explained away with humours, vapours, and curses. But in the late Victorian age, a new enemy entered the stage, the germ. It was Joseph Lister who carried the banner of antiseptic surgery, Louis Pasteur who shouted of microbes, Robert Koch who traced bacteria to specific diseases. These men began to dismantle centuries of superstition brick by brick, replacing it with a new architecture of science. Yet as with all revolutions, the first to raise their banners were ridiculed, resisted, ignored. Imagine the hospital before antisepsis. Wooden floors stained with blood, straw scattered underfoot to soak up fluids, surgeons wearing coats so stiff with dried gore they could stand upright on their own. Instruments were wiped casually on trousers, or not at all. Water was scarce, soap considered optional, and germs were dismissed as fantasy. When a patient died of infection days after surgery, doctors spoke of bad air, of constitutional weakness, of fate. To admit their own hands were the executioners was unthinkable, and yet, Lister thought it. He watched wounds fester, amputations rot, mothers die of puerperal fever, and he dared to wonder if something unseen was to blame. He borrowed from Pasteur, who had already declared that fermentation was caused by microscopic life. What if infection was the same? What if wounds rotted not because of fate, but because of invaders carried by doctors themselves? The idea was radical, insulting even. Imagine telling a surgeon in a blood-stiffened coat that he was in effect a murderer. It did not go over well. Lister began to spray carbolic acid over wounds, over instruments, over entire operating rooms. The smell was sharp, acrid, burning. Surgeons coughed. Patients gagged. Nurses complained their hands cracked raw. But the death rates fell. Slowly, grudgingly, others noticed. Not all at once, not everywhere, but enough to begin the slow turn of medicine away from ritual and towards science. Pasteur, meanwhile, worked in his laboratories, peering through microscopes, boiling flasks, proving that life did not simply arise spontaneously from filth. Invisible creatures, he showed, caused fermentation, decay, disease. He created vaccines, demonstrated contagion, revolutionized agriculture, and then medicine itself. Koch went further, identifying the bacteria behind anthrax, tuberculosis, cholera. The villains were no longer bad airs, but living organisms, tiny, silent, deadly. Still, the resistance was fierce. Many physicians scoffed. They mocked Pasteur's germ phantoms, dismissed Koch's bacteria as curiosities irrelevant to practice. Tradition is a stubborn beast, and the Victorians adored tradition. A man in a waistcoat with a scalpel and a reputation was not about to admit he had been spreading death for decades with his unwashed hands. Pride stood taller than microscopes. Back in your sick room, the doctor explained this with a tone of superiority, as though he has always believed in germs. In truth, he probably ridiculed them only a few years ago. But medicine has a way of rewriting its own story, erasing doubt, pretending certainty was always there. He speaks of progress, of science, of the dawning modern age. You want to believe him. You want to believe that at last medicine is becoming less about poison and bleeding and more about truth. But progress is uneven. For every hospital that sterilized instruments, another continued as before. For every surgeon who washed hands, another scoffed. For every midwife vindicated by germ theory, another was silenced. The battle between old and new raged in wards and journals, in surgeries and sick rooms. Some patients lived because of science, others died because of pride. Consider childbirth again. Puerperal fever killed thousands, entire maternity wards emptied by infection. Doctors carried death from corpse to cradle, never washing, never thinking. When Ignaz Semmelweis in Vienna insisted on hand-washing, he was ridiculed, dismissed, driven into despair. Only decades later did Lister and Pasteur vindicate him. Too late for the women who had already died. Progress saved future lives, but offered no comfort to the ghosts already buried. Consider surgery. Carbolic acid made wounds safer, but it stung, burned, cracked skin. Surgeons grumbled, some abandoned it. Antisepsis spread slowly, unevenly, imperfectly. Patients still died, though fewer. The line between miracle and tragedy remained thin, razor-sharp, merciless. And yet, the shift was real. Germ theory changed everything, even beyond hospitals. Cities began to see sewage not just as nuisance, but as threat. Clean water became priority, milk was pasteurized, food inspected. Public health emerged not just as aspiration, but as necessity. For the first time, medicine looked outward as well as inward, recognizing that disease was not just in bodies, but in streets, in air, in water. Back in your room, you sip cautiously from your jug, hoping perhaps this time the water is cleaner. The doctor assures you it is, though he says so with the same confidence he once reserved for arsenic wafers. Still you sense a change. The candlelight flickers on the little book he brought, its pages filled with drawings of microbes, notes about experiments, names of men who dared to challenge tradition. The world is turning, slowly, painfully, but turning nonetheless. And you, lying beneath your blankets, realize that Victorian medicine was not only about killing, it was also about stumbling, blindly, clumsily, towards saving. That every lancet, every tonic, every quack device existed alongside real discovery. That in the fog of superstition, tiny sparks of truth were beginning to glow. Outside, the city groans on, its pipes rumbling, its hospitals buzzing, its laboratories flickering with candlelight over microscopes. Somewhere, a surgeon washes his hands for the first time. Somewhere else, a midwife mutters that she's been saying the same for years. Somewhere, a patient lives who would once have died, because someone finally believed in what they could not see. And here in your little room the candle burns low. You close your eyes, drifting between past and future, between the poisons that nearly killed you and the science that might yet save you. The air feels no cleaner, the water no safer, but in the back of your mind a quiet thought flickers. Perhaps tomorrow will be different. The rain has eased outside, leaving the streets glistening like black glass beneath the gas lamps. The doctor does not come tonight with forceps, powders or belts that hum like angry crickets. Instead, he leans back in your wooden chair and begins to speak of daily life. Not his cures, not his theories, but what ordinary families do when illness creeps into their homes and there is no doctor at hand. Because in truth, medicine for most Victorians was not professional. It was improvised, cobbled, together from superstition, kitchen cupboards, prayer, and whatever scraps of advice could be borrowed from neighbours. Imagine the cramped tenement of a London labourer's family. The father returns from the factory with a cough that rattles his chest like loose change. The mother dips a rag in vinegar and ties it around his neck, believing the sharp scent will draw out sickness. When the cough worsens, she sets an onion on the bedside table, sliced in half, its pungent fumes expected to suck poison from the air. If the fever climbs higher, she rubs his chest with goose fat and mustard powder until the skin burns red, muttering that if the body stings, the illness must be fleeing. Or picture a rural cottage far from city doctors. A child wakes in the night, feverish, restless. The grandmother hobbles to the hearth, grinds dried herbs in a mortar and mixes them into warm ale. The mixture is bitter, but it's swallowed anyway, followed by whispered prayers and the sign of the cross. The family waits, listening to the fire crackle, hoping that the fever will break by dawn. If it does, they thank God. If it doesn't, they still thank God, but a little less cheerfully. Superstition lingered like smoke in every corner. A horseshoe nailed above the door to ward off sickness. Bread baked with special herbs to strengthen the blood. Charms tied to wrists. Red strings wound around infants' arms. Silver coins pressed into palms. Some believed illness was punishment for sin. Others that it came from spirits. Others still that fairies played tricks. Few agreed, but all acted. Because doing something, anything, was better than the helplessness of watching a loved one suffer. Prayer was constant. Entire families knelt by bedsides murmuring pleas for mercy. Churches rang with petitions for healing during outbreaks. Processions carried icons through the streets. Faith and medicine blurred until it was hard to know whether the cure was the tonic or the prayer muttered over it. And perhaps it didn't matter. If one gave hope and the other dulled pain, both were necessary. Household manuals flourished, filled with recipes for home remedies, vinegar and honey for coughs, coal tar for skin eruptions, boiled nettles for purifying the blood, camphor rubbed on chests for colds. Families wrote remedies into the margins of their Bibles, passed them from mother to daughter, neighbour to neighbour. Some worked a little, many did nothing, a few were downright harmful. But they endured, because medicine was too expensive, doctors too rare, hospitals too terrifying. And then there were the rituals that straddled the line between sense and absurdity. Hanging a bag of camphor around the neck during cholera outbreaks, believing the sharp odour repelled disease, burning tar in the hearth to cleanse the air, drinking warm beer before bed to keep the humours lively, wrapping patients in sheets dipped in cold water, then piling blankets on, top until they sweated buckets, the sweat praised as proof the illness was leaving. Children, of course, received their own share of peculiar care, teething powders laced with mercury, as if infants needed an early start on poisoning. Rags soaked in brandy pressed to their gums, a dab of soot rubbed on rashes because soot was drying. If nightmares came, Parents chalked it up to fairies or spirits, pinning sprigs of rowan under pillows to keep mischief away. And yet, amid all the absurdity, some remedies worked. Willow bark eased fevers, its salicylic acid a natural ancestor of aspirin. Garlic helped with infections. Mint soothed stomachs. Honey calmed coughs. The line between quackery and real pharmacology was thinner than anyone realised. Families stumbled into effective medicine by accident, preserving remedies that science would only later explain. Still, desperation often outweighed caution. Picture a desperate mother spooning lamp oil into her child's mouth to cure worms, only to watch in horror as the child convulses. Picture a father applying kerosene to his son's scalp to strengthen hair, only to blister the skin raw. Picture a grandmother muttering incantations while pressing a hot iron near a wound, insisting the heat will scare away spirits. The logic is absent, but the love is real. Frantic, misguided, but real. Back in your room, you think of these families. How many relied on onions and vinegar instead of doctors? How many prayed louder than they bled? How many clung to charms and whispered to shadows because science had not yet given them answers? Your own blanket smells faintly of camphor tucked into the fabric by a well-meaning relative who swore it would keep the fever at bay. You're not sure whether to laugh or cry. Yet these rituals were more than medicine. They were community. Neighbours gathered around sick beds, bringing broth, herbs, advice. Women shared remedies over washing lines. Men compared cures at taverns, trading recipes for tonics as readily as gossip. Illness was not a solitary burden, but a shared event, woven into the fabric of daily life. In a way, the household cure was less about healing the body and more about comforting the heart. Even the failures had meaning. When the onion shriveled on the bedside table, families could at least say they tried. When the bread flavoured with herbs tasted bitter, they could say they fought. When the prayer was whispered, they could believe someone listened. In a century where medicine so often harmed more than it helped, these fragile rituals gave people something rare, a sense of agency. Your doctor, of course, dismisses it all. He scoffs at onions and vinegar, waves away charms and prayers. To him, only science holds power. But you see differently. You see the mother sitting by the hearth, the grandmother grinding herbs, the father tying charms above doors. You see the love behind every gesture, the desperation carved into every ritual. And though the remedies may fail, the care itself heals something unseen. The candlelight flickers, the blanket warms you, and you imagine those countless households across the city, all improvising, all hoping, all fumbling towards survival. And you realise that Victorian medicine was not only about doctors and their bags of instruments. It was about kitchens, hearths, whispered prayers, and desperate love. Because in the end, medicine is never only science. It is also faith and hope and the fragile rituals we invent when the world offers no answers. The night is quiet now, the rain having faded into a soft drizzle against the panes, the street outside glistening like a mirror for the gas lamps. In your room, the candle burns low, its flame a thin thread trembling against the shadows. The doctor has left for the last time, his bag lighter, his boots fading down the hall. And here you lie, your body still humming with laudanum, your veins still faintly aching from the lancet, your stomach still unsettled from arsenic wafers, your nerves still tingling from the electric belts. All around you, echoes of Victorian medicine linger like ghosts. The leeches in their jar have gone still, floating in silence as if even they have grown weary. The arsenic packets sit unopened now, their glitter dulled by damp air. The laudanum bottle gleams faintly at your bedside, half empty, patient, waiting for tomorrow. The fainting couch by the wall seems to beckon, though you're already supine, too exhausted to collapse anywhere else. Every cure has promised relief. Every cure has exacted its own price. And as you lie there, your thoughts drift through all the strange company this century has offered. The corset, praised as both fashion and medical brace, squeezing until faintness seemed like grace. Mercury, shining and deadly, poured into mouths as though salvation came in liquid silver. Laudanum whispering softly with each amber drop, soothing and silencing until lives blurred into fog. leeches, eager mouths pressed against the skin, taking more than illness. The knife flashing in unwashed hands, promising survival by speed alone. Electricity buzzing through nerves with false hope. Asylums, their stone walls echoing with cries mistaken for science. And still, amid all the poisons and errors, there was change. Germ theory creeping in, whispered by Pasteur, proven by Koch, defended by Lister, even when mocked. Clean water slowly replacing filth, sewers carving their way under streets, vaccinations spreading through suspicion and resistance until eventually smallpox itself was beaten back. The century was cruel, but it was not entirely blind. You breathe slowly, shallowly, and the candlelight glows on the ceiling above you. For a moment the room feels like a museum of treatments, every object around you a relic of attempts, misguided or miraculous, to keep humanity alive. And perhaps that is the truth of it. Medicine is less a straight path than a stumbling, desperate march through trial and error, where every step forward costs lives, and every mistake becomes a grave. The sounds outside fade. The horse hooves on cobblestones, the clatter of carriages, the vendors shouting in the markets, all distant now, replaced by the softer rhythm of drizzle. You imagine the city still alive with its hidden bottles, its powders, its belts and belts of quackery, its advertisements pasted to walls, promising miracles that tomorrow's coroner will disprove. You imagine families kneeling by sick beds, whispering prayers as onions rot on bedside tables. You imagine infants silent in their cradles, their lips stained by syrup. You imagine women pale in candlelight, praised for beauty that was only the shadow of addiction, and you realize the cruel symmetry of it all, that Victorian medicine nearly killed you not simply with its poisons, but with its faith. Faith in leeches, faith in tonics, faith in powders, faith in doctors who strode through fog with unwashed hands and unshakable confidence. It was not malice that harmed you, it was certainty, dressed in waistcoats, perfumed with authority. Your eyes grow heavy, and the candle shortens further, its flame no bigger than a pin. The room grows softer, edges blurring, shadows deepening. You think of the countless voices silenced by these cures, the countless families convinced they had done everything right. And you think too of the fragile hope that remained, the experiments that pointed toward tomorrow, the discoveries that would save lives long after yours. So tonight, as you drift, let the weight of history soften around you. Let the sharp edges of arsenic and steel fade. Let the buzz of electricity fall silent. Let the cries from asylums grow distant. Let the stench of the Thames be carried away by cleaner waters. Let the faith in science, slow and stumbling though it was, settle like a gentle hand on your shoulder. You'd never make it through a single Victorian night, but you have travelled through its shadows now, and still you rest. You have carried its poisons, its knives, its ghostly cures, and still you breathe. That is enough. So close your eyes and let the city fade. Let the gas lamps flicker out, the carriages roll into silence, the fog fold itself over rooftops like a blanket. Let the candle die gently, leaving only the warmth of your bed, the hush of your breath, the quiet promise that even history softens in the end. The night is long, but here in this room the silence is gentle, and you are safe now, safe to drift, safe to rest. Sleep, and let the strange century of medicine close its door behind you.